falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 11, guilty, another felony charge of falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 12, guilty, another felony charge, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 13, guilty, another felony charge of falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 14, guilty. Count 15, guilty. That is 15 out of 15 so far. Count 16, Donald Trump found guilty, 16 out of 16 when it comes to falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 17, guilty. That is from a July 2017 payment to Michael Cohen. Count 18, guilty. That is another felony charge. Count 19, guilty. Another felony charge, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 20, guilty. Another felony charge, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 21, 20 and 21, both guilty. This is for an August 2017 payment. So is count 22, also guilty. Count 23, guilty, also guilty. Donald Trump found guilty of falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 24, guilty, another felony charge. Count 25, guilty, another felony charge, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 26, guilty, another felony charge, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 27, guilty, another felony charge, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 28, guilty, another felony charge, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 29, guilty, felony charge, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 30, guilty, felony charge, falsifying business records. Count 31, guilty, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 32, guilty, falsifying business records in the first degree. Only 2 counts left. Count 33, former President Donald Trump found guilty, falsifying business records. Count 34, guilty. Donald Trump found guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. All 34 are felonies. Donald Trump has now been convicted of 34 different felony crimes by a jury of his peers in Manhattan. 34 felony charges for former President Donald J. Trump, convicted of 34 felony charges having to do with falsifying business records to cover up hush money payments to Stormy Daniels. An unbelievable moment in American history. The jurors are now being asked about their agreement with these charges, and they are responding yes. Trump has a frowned expression on his face as the verdict reading is completed. He is not moving. The former president of the United States, now a convicted felon, having been found guilty of 34 felony charges by a jury of his peers in Manhattan, New York. The court officer is asked if either party wants the jury polled. Trump attorney Todd Blanche says yes. This is when they go around and ask each juror if they agree with what has just been read by the foreperson. The jurors all have straight faces. They are now being polled.
Former President Donald Trump has been convicted by a Manhattan jury on all 34 counts of falsifying business records to cover up a sex scandal ahead of the 2016 presidential election. The guilty verdict makes him the first former president ever convicted of a crime. The presiding judge, Juan Merchan, now faces the unprecedented task of sentencing Trump. The historic verdict is expected to raise a series of legal and political questions in the coming months, and the process could be further complicated if he wins a second presidential term. Trump has already laid the groundwork for his appeal and is poised to leverage the outcome to advance his narrative of victimhood and political persecution. But campaigning under the shadow of a criminal conviction is uncharted territory for presidential politics. So what happens now that Trump has been convicted? Will he be sent to prison? Can he appeal? Can he even vote for himself in the November election? We're going to answer your questions. Can Trump still run for president? Yes, even with a conviction, Donald Trump can still run for president. A felony conviction does not legally prevent someone from running for president, even if they were in prison. The Constitution says that all natural-born citizens who are at least 35 years old and have been a resident of the U.S. for 14 years can run for president. Being a felon isn't a disqualifier. History also tells us that candidates with criminal convictions have run for president in the past, albeit unsuccessfully. About 100 years ago, Eugene Debs ran for president while in federal prison as the nominee of the Socialist Party, and he got close to 1 million votes without ever hitting the campaign trail. Another convicted presidential candidate, Lyndon LaRouche, ran for president in every election between 1976 and 2004, including one campaign from prison, but he only got over 26,000 votes. So for Trump, he can continue his campaign even with a conviction. Will Donald Trump go to prison? This is the main question on everyone's mind now that he's been convicted. It's possible, but it's not a certainty. The judge in this case, Juan Merchan, has final discretion in sentencing. And given factors like Trump's age, he's about to turn 78, and his lack of prior convictions, he might avoid prison time. In fact, most first-time offenders in nonviolent cases are often sentenced to probation and fines instead. That being said, it is possible the judge decides to incarcerate Trump. And if he does, it's expected the sentence would be anywhere from 1 to 4 years, either at New York City's Rikers Island or in one of New York's 44 state prisons. But Trump would be no ordinary prisoner. The U.S. Secret Service is required by law to protect former presidents at all times. So the prison would also need to accommodate his Secret Service protective detail. And unlike his other pending criminal cases, Trump would not be able to try to pardon himself of his felony conviction if he's elected president again. And that's because falsifying business records is a state crime, and only the New York governor could pardon him. Ahead of sentencing on July 11, both parties are expected to submit a memo to the judge with sentencing recommendations. Trump will be able to gather character letters from friends, family members, and colleagues, and he'll also likely do a pre-sentence interview with a psychologist or a social worker in which he can try to make a good impression and explain why he deserves a lighter punishment. But until sentencing on July 11, Trump remains free. Can Trump appeal the guilty verdict, and how long will an appeal take? Donald Trump almost immediately vowed to appeal the guilty verdict, and that process could take months to play out. It would likely begin at the appellate division in Manhattan and could eventually reach the Court of Appeals in Albany. It's hard to say how long that would take, but given the significance of the case, it's possible that the appeals process wraps up after Election Day. Can Trump still vote? So we know that Trump can still run for president with a felony conviction, but can he vote for himself as a convicted felon? Well, it depends. For Trump to lose his voting rights, he would need to actually be in prison at the time of the November election. And like I said earlier, it is possible that the judge hands him a prison sentence, but if his appeal takes longer than 6 months, then he'll be able to vote. Now, the Constitution does not address whether convicted felons have the right to vote, but several states impose limitations on their voting privileges. In Florida, where Trump lives and has voted since 2020, a felon's eligibility to vote depends on the laws of the state where the conviction occurred, which in this instance is New York, which only revokes a felon's voting rights while they are incarcerated. So if Trump receives a probationary sentence, he would maintain his eligibility to vote. The only way he wouldn't is if he were in prison at the time of the election. So what would a conviction in the hush money case mean for Trump's 3 federal cases? Well, first, let me give some background. Trump is facing 40 felony counts in Florida for allegedly hoarding classified documents and obstructing the government's efforts to retrieve them, as well as 4 counts in Washington related to his alleged efforts to overturn the 2020 election, and 13 counts in Georgia in connection to his alleged attempts to overturn the 2020 election result in that state. While the conviction in the hush money trial does not directly impact Trump's other cases, it could significantly influence his legal strategy and public perception. The guilty verdict could embolden prosecutors, it could affect jury perceptions, and potentially impact whether he's willing to negotiate a plea deal or settlement agreement in those cases, or if he's willing to take the stand in those trials. It might also undermine Trump's credibility in future trials, and it's possible judges may take the conviction into consideration when determining sentencing. Ultimately, we don't know what impact the conviction will have, but it is possible that it influences his legal defense in his other cases and shapes the public's perception of his legal troubles.
I slept with Stormy. At first I used to own it. Now I am getting it on Michael Cohen. The problem is she knows the details and discuss them in a court of law. She knows all about my erectile dysfunction. It's mushroom. She has seen me naked and know about my limits. bedroom.
Hey there, sexy ladies. I just wanted to take a second and remind you, if you need some TBE, some dark Brandon energy in your life, all you gotta do is vote blue in November. That's right. And go out and vote blue. I am dark Brandon.
Meek and I were having a conversation in between breaks.
Yeah.
And she disagrees with me. But
I do.
But Alex reminds me that my argument sort of goes parallel with what you're saying anyway. My argument is this: Trump always gets away with it. Anybody else that did what he did on January 6th would be in jail by now. Anybody else. And we can go case by case by case. We can talk about nuclear secrets, stealing the nuclear secrets, telling your IT guy, destroy the nuclear secrets. When he wouldn't do it, telling your maintenance guy, flood the IT room. All of this. And yet, I'm sorry, I think he's going to get away with it because the law does not apply to Donald Trump. I don't know why. It doesn't. And a lot of times, in this case, they're self-inflicted wounds. But somehow he always gets away with it, which leads to your point, which is this. Folks, we got to beat him at the ballot box. If we're going to destroy the radicalism of Trumpism, we've got to do it at the ballot box. Don't expect a magical judgment to come from a courtroom.
I am dark Brandon.
Nobel Prize-winning economists are backing Vice President Kamala Harris's vision for the economy, calling it vastly superior to the plans laid out by former President Donald Trump. 23 U.S. recipients of the prestigious award have signed a letter serving as a stamp of approval for Harris's economic agenda. According to the group, the Vice President's agenda will improve the overall health of the economy, while Trump's policies will greatly increase tariffs, something he seems to be obsessed with. Joining us now from the Southwest Wall, former Treasury official and Morning Joe economic analyst Steve Ratner. Steve, take us through this.
Yeah, Mika, well, you saw the Nobel Prize announcement by the economists, and it's indicative of what economists feel about it. So let me show you one other survey of economists, and then we'll get into the details of why economists feel as strongly as they do. So the Wall Street Journal surveyed 39 economists, and what they found was this: a lot of support for many of Harris's key plans, 74 support for her tax credit of $6,000 for new babies, 59 support for raising the corporate tax cut, 64% for capping insulin prices at $35 for everyone, and 46%, roughly 50-50, for capping out-of-pocket spending on prescription drugs. Less support for a couple of other things, but basically very strong support. Contrast that over here with Donald Trump, who got 8% support from economists for making his tax cuts permanent, exactly 0 support for his tariffs of 20%, and 5% support for eliminating taxes on Social Security benefits, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. So the dramatic contrast between support for Harris on the one side, no support basically for Trump on the other side, from 39 economists from across the board.
So, Steve, you can already hear Trump's campaign, Trump's supporters saying, oh, these are pointy-headed economists, these are academics, who cares? We can point them, though, to the economist from the Wall Street Journal or Goldman Sachs, who says that Kamala Harris's economy will be better than Donald Trump. So let's move to your second chart about what a Trump plan would actually do to the economy if implemented the way he's pitching it.
Yeah, so why are these economists so opposed to Trump's plan? Because the economic effects would be pretty terrible. This is a study done by Bloomberg Economics, and they found that Harris's plan did not have much change in either the GDP or inflation, which in a sense is a good thing at this point. But look at what Trump's plan would do. Trump's plan would cut the GDP by 8.9%. And let me put that in perspective for you. This is roughly twice the amount that the GDP went down during the financial crisis.
Wow.
So we would be looking at something between a recession and a depression. And interestingly, as I'm sure people know because we've talked about this many times, the tariffs would cause certainly a part of this. But the biggest cause, actually, of this drop are the mass deportations that Trump is talking about, because he would take huge pieces of our labor force out of the country, send them back to or send them somewhere else, and the result would be business wouldn't have labor. They wouldn't be able to produce things, and you'd have this enormous economic contraction. So this is something we've never seen before in terms of scoring a set of policy proposals from a presidential candidate. The other reason why Harris seems to be doing better, or maybe doing better for her economic thoughts relative to Trump, is maybe people are figuring out what's actually in these two plans. And one of the most important things in these two plans are the differences in their tax proposals. Harris's tax proposal would raise incomes for people at the bottom 20%, for people in the 20 to 40% percentile by fairly significant amounts. She would she would raise taxes for people at the higher incomes down here, in the 99 to 100 and the 95 to 99. Trump does the opposite. He raises after-tax incomes for people at the highest incomes up here. And believe it or not, if you're at the bottom, Trump's tax plan would actually increase your taxes slightly. So maybe people are figuring out these kinds of differences and changing their view of her economic plan versus Trump's economic plan.
Well, Steve, that's a good point. We were just talking earlier about a poll this morning that showed that the economic advantage had been taken away from Donald Trump. There was also an AP poll that came out earlier this week that showed the same thing, that it's pretty much a statistical tie. Even though Harris is ahead on taxes, Harris is ahead on housing costs, Harris is ahead on some things that no one would have believed they would have been ahead of before Harris Waltz. But it's very interesting. There's something else going on here, isn't there? Because when the Biden White House tried to push up Bidenomics, it didn't work. Inflation was still coming down. Gas prices were still coming down. But they hadn't gotten to where they are now. I wonder if some of the shifts, and it's dramatic shifts unless you look at partisan polls, it's dramatic shifts like in this AP poll on the economy toward Harris. I wonder if that has to do with the fact that gas prices just keep dropping. Inflation just keeps dropping. The interest rates have dropped. I mean, people are actually seeing it in their day-to-day life, that some things still cost too much when they go to the grocery store. Some things still cost too much when they go to Home Depot, but after a while, they're comparing it to what it was a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and they see that everything's going in the right direction as far as inflation, cost of living, and most importantly, the difference between the cost of living and their living wages going up.
Sure, Joe. Yes. Look, we have, as you have pointed out, and actually the cover of The Economist this week calls our economy the envy of the world. We have the most amazing economy, and our economic projections and our economic results continue to get better. Growth is faster than people thought, and as you said, inflation has come down almost to the Fed's 2% target, which is really quite extraordinary. Yeah, some things absolutely still cost too much, but it is all moving in the right direction.
All right, Steve, let's move to your third chart about the national debt. Obviously, Donald Trump, as president, racked up massive historic debt for the country. What would it do this time around?
So maybe voters are starting to process this as well. And one of the things that Donald Trump has done, among his more cynical things that he's done, where he's throwing out tax cuts for everybody over time and this and that, is cutting taxes on Social Security benefits. And that may sound like something you want to do, but the consequences of it would be pretty terrible, because the Social Security Trust Fund, which is already going to run out of money out in 2034, would be decimated by eliminating Social Security taxes from their source of income, and insolvency would come 3 years earlier, and there would be a huge cost to other taxpayers, presumably, to make up for this gap. So maybe voters are starting to figure that out. And then also is the budget deficit and the debt. And this, again, may be something people are beginning to get aware of. So if you combine Harris's tax proposals together, she would have actually a fairly minimal impact on the debt, $500 billion over 10 years. So that's relatively small in the context of what we got. Trump's tax cuts, even with these are his tariffs, by the way, so we know what those would have done. But Trump's tax cuts, this rather cynical giveaway to everybody and anybody, would add $3 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years. So the party that's supposed to be the party of fiscal responsibility turns out to be the party of fiscal irresponsibility. And again, perhaps voters are starting to figure that out.
So, Steve, with all that data behind you on the wall, including that eye-popping second chart that shows Trump's plan would crater the economy, according to leading economists, why will you go to, I don't know, a cocktail party or an event of some kind, or just be out in the street and talk to your friends who work in the financial world who say, yeah, I'm going with Trump this time? What is the rationale, as guys who understand the economy so well, who know the Dow is soared above 43,000, who know tariffs are bad for the economy, will lead to inflation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? What is the argument people who are so smart about money and the economy are making in spite of that data behind you?
It's a great question, Willie. The argument is basically, what I hear back from them is basically twofold. One, they don't think Trump's going to do all this stuff. And, you know, if that's the way you want to vote and you want to guess that the guy who says he's going to do all this stuff isn't going to do all this stuff, then I guess that's one way to approach it. The other thing they say is that he will be good for business, that he will cut regulations to the bone, he will not block mergers the way the Biden-Harris administration has stopped some mergers that were anti-competitive, that essentially it'll be free reign in Washington for the business community, and they'll get whatever they want. And they'll be able to essentially run their business, merge, do whatever, without a lot of government regulation. There is, I have to say, some unhappiness in the business community about regulations in the last 4 years, and they view Trump as the kind of, no pun intended, get out of jail card for business with in terms of what they'd be able to do under a Trump administration.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just incredible. I mean, again, the Dow at record levels, the S&P at record levels, as the Economist article, and I talk about all the time, you talk about all the time, the United States economy is the envy of the world. We have a $27 trillion GDP to China's $18 trillion GDP. Texas has a bigger GDP than Russia. California has a bigger GDP than India and Canada and Britain and every other country in the world. California, the supposed socialist state of California, other than 3 others. I mean, we could go down the list. The dollar over the past 4 years at 50-year highs. The jobless rate lower, below 4% for longer than any time over the last 30 years. I could continue on and on. I mean, Amazon has a higher R&D budget than any G7 country. Could go on and on. It just never stops. And you look at these individual people on Wall Street, these billionaires. They're talking about, oh, well, we need Trump. Trump might be better for us. And Ross Sorkin yesterday talked about one of Trump's biggest fans, who, of course, was against him after January 6th, but I guess changed his tune. Steve Schwartzman was worth $25 billion when Kamala Harris became vice president. He's worth $50 billion today because the economy has exploded so much, and the Dow has exploded so much, and the S&P has exploded so much. And this is the story of all of these billionaires, Steve. It doesn't make sense. And for you and me, when you talk about the debt, I'm gravely concerned about the $35 trillion debt. This has to be addressed. And yet Donald Trump broke all records when he was president for being fiscally reckless. And now, with his proposals, according to economists quoted by the Wall Street Journal, it's going to happen again.
Yeah, that's the risk, Joe, is that he actually does this stuff this time, and you get these kinds of results. But just to add on to a couple of things you said, because you said it all so well, but for example, on the businessmen, they complain about Harris, but yet if you look at business investment in this country, it's off the charts high. Why is it off the charts high? Confidence in America, our strong economy, but also, ironically, some of the Biden-Harris policies, like the Inflation Reduction Act, which has spurred this extraordinary upsurge in investment in renewable energy and all kinds of things for the new economy. I was in Silicon Valley last week, and we are the center of artificial intelligence research and development in the world. There's nobody else who's even close. And the dynamism out there and the excitement about that is really quite breathtaking. And so, yes, this is an extraordinary economy, and it has made a lot of people very, very, very wealthy. And I personally obviously think it's a better bet than going down this rabbit hole and potentially having 10 or 20% tariffs and a disastrous economy.
All right. Morning Joe economic analyst Steve Ratner, thank you as always. We appreciate your insight.
We have major breaking news to tell you about in the case of the United States of America versus Donald J. Trump. With permission from Judge Tanya Chutkan, Special Counsel Jack Smith has released a filing detailing never-before-seen evidence he has compiled against Donald Trump in his investigation of the federal election interference case. It begins with the defense of Jack Smith's entire case in light of the Supreme Court's immunity decision, which divides official acts from private acts, giving presidents immunity for official ones. It reads in part, quote, "The defendant asserts that he is immune from prosecution for his criminal scheme to overturn the 2020 presidential election because, he claims, it entailed official conduct. Not so. Although the defendant was the incumbent president during the charged conspiracies, his scheme was fundamentally a private one. This motion provides a comprehensive account of the defendant's private criminal conduct. This, quote, comprehensive account of Donald Trump's criminal conduct is 165 pages long. It's here on our desk. We just got it a few minutes ago. Fortunately for us, we have an entire team of experts, lawyers, and reporters combing through it right now from front to back, from back to front. That breaking news is where we start today with former top prosecutor at the Department of Justice, Andrew Weissman. Also joining us, former U.S. Attorney and former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Harry Littman. With me at the table, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. Let me read a little bit more to you all. On page 4, quote, "At its core, the defendant Donald Trump's scheme was a private criminal effort. In his capacity as a candidate, the defendant used deceit to target every stage of the electoral process, which, through the Constitution, the Electoral Count Act, and state laws, includes the state's notification to the federal government of the selection of their representative electors based on the popular vote in the state, the meeting of those electors to cast their votes consistent with the popular vote, and Congress's counting of the electors' votes at a certification proceeding." At its core, the scheme was a private criminal effort. That feels like one among many of the headlines, Andrew Weissman.
Nicole, I don't like to jump to something that sounds like hyperbole, but there is no question that there are repeated bombshells in this submission. And I cannot tell you that I've finished the 165 pages. Let me tell you why I think this is so devastating. First, the prosecution recounts direct evidence against the former president. Conversations directly with him by lawyers and by Mike Pence himself. At one point, one of the lawyers tells him that there's no proof of any fraud that would be outcome determinative. That claim to the otherwise, or he uses an expletive, says it's BS. He has recounted conversations with Pence himself, describing that the claims of election fraud that the president is making are not true. So this is direct evidence. There also is direct evidence of the president saying, I don't care about the details. I don't care that we would lose in court. And when he's warned that there would be violence, on page 8 of the filing, when he's warned that if he continues this, that there could be violence, he says, make them riot. That's a quote. Make them riot, do it. Those are quotes from the submission in terms of the cavalier attitude of the former president in connection with the anticipated violence. And we all could see on January 6th exactly what happened and the violence that ensued.
Andrew Weissman, I'll read from that section. In the immediate post-election period, while the defendant, Donald Trump, claimed fraud without proof, his private operatives sought to create chaos rather than seek clarity at polling places where states were continuing to tabulate votes. For example, on November 4th, a campaign employee, agent, and co-conspirator of the defendant tried to sow confusion when the ongoing vote count at the TCF Center in Detroit, Michigan looked unfavorable to the defendant. That's Donald Trump. There, when a colleague at the TCF Center told a redacted witness here, we think a batch of votes heavily in Biden's favor is right. The witness responded, find a reason it isn't. Give me options to file litigation. And even if it is, when the colleague suggested that there was about to be unrest reminiscent of the Brooks Brothers riot, a violent effort to stop the vote count in Florida after the 2000 presidential election, P5, person 5, responded, quote, make them riot and do it. The defendant's campaign operatives and supporters used similar tactics at other tabulation centers, including in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Andrew Weissman, it gets at something that the January 6th committee got at and around, and I think they would say all of the evidence they developed was telling this story, but they didn't puncture perhaps the innermost circle, which is Donald Trump's voice. They get at the innermost circle of both premeditation, intent, and state of mind. Talk about that, the power of that evidence.
Absolutely. So that is exactly the limitation. As terrific as the work was of the congressional hearing and how much they did with limited tools, if you recall, Mike Pence did not testify and provide evidence there, nor did certain witnesses come in and say what their direct conversations were with Donald Trump. So they talked around meetings, they talked about certain things that happened, but they would not talk about those direct conversations. What this filing shows is Jack Smith did just that. He has those conversations, direct evidence with respect to the former president, direct knowledge to show that he knew that his claims were false. And I think, that's one where we knew that was going to exist. I find the statements about what he thinks about violence is something that is both devastating for the legal case, and you would know better than I, but from a political case, especially in light of the kind of claims that were made yesterday at the vice presidential debate to sort of sugarcoat and whitewash what happened on January 6th, this has Donald Trump being so incredibly cavalier. Remember, at the time that he is reported to be making these statements, he is the sitting president of the United States. And when he is told about potential violence, it is not how do we prevent it. The quote is, do it, make them riot. So it is just so antithetical to what you do when you are a government official, as Nicole, you have been, and I have been, and Harry has been. That is, you take an oath of office to defend the Constitution, to uphold the law. So those kinds of statements that Jack Smith clearly has are really devastating, I think, both from a legal perspective and then obviously potentially from a political perspective.
Okay, I want to turn the conversation to Pence. I want to bring Lisa Rubin in, who just gasped upon reading something on page 142. I'll share what you read that made you gasp, and then let's dive into what we know to be new, and that is Mike Pence's voice on all of this. What we have were our eyeballs on Mike Pence's movements on that day. What we had were our ears on the sound of actually a disguised voice testifying before the January 6th Select Committee about the calls, the kinds of calls that came into the sit room back at the White House from Mike Pence's security detail. But we didn't know much in Mike Pence's own voice. We didn't know what he would say under oath as a witness in a criminal proceeding, but now we do. Let me read to you. I'll read first what made Lisa Rubin gasp. Why make everybody wait? From page 142, quote, upon receiving a phone call alerting him, Donald Trump, that Pence had been taken to a secure location, witness P15 rushed to the dining room to inform the defendant, Donald Trump, in hopes that the defendant, Donald Trump, would take action to ensure Mike Pence's safety. Instead, after this person delivered the news, the defendant, Donald Trump, looked at him and said only, quote, so what? Lisa?
The cavalierness with which Donald Trump received that news certainly is news to me. And it goes to Andrew's point about a number of the allegations here not being just things we've seen before in the January 6th committee and in the transcripts that were generated by that committee's investigation. There's a whole lot of new content here, Nicole, and that is just one part of it. I want to also talk about the fact that while much of the public focus is going to be on the interactions between Trump and Pence as a witness before the government, there is so much else here outside of Pence, so that even if a higher court at a later point decides that those conversations really are off limits, it doesn't change the fact that, for example, there are huge chunks of this brief that talk about things that are solely outside the executive branch entirely, including a many-page-long section about Trump's outreach to officials in other states, including his infamous phone call to Doug Ducey, the governor of Arizona, his meeting with the two heads of the Michigan state houses in the White House, a call to then Speaker of the Arizona State House, Rusty Bowers, a call to Chris Carr, the then and current Attorney General of Georgia, and of course the infamous call to Brad Raffensperger. There's also a huge section on the fake electors scheme, which was largely perpetrated by people outside government, including then chair of the Republican National Committee, Ronna McDaniel, and Rudy Giuliani, as well as others. So I think the focus publicly today is properly on Pence because there's so much about that we don't know. But in terms of thinking about what the right legal outcome here should be, I want to make sure that people understand that there is so much here that is solely private in its nature that Trump and his team of lawyers can't get around. They may have delayed the ultimate judgment day, and depending on the outcome of the election, there may be no judgment day. But in a real court upholding the rule of law, there is a plethora of conduct here that is purely private and outside that presidential immunity ruling that should see the light of day at trial.
And
that point about the sort of drama in the document and the narrative arc of it, specifically the pressure on Pence, which comes through in the January 6th committee report a bit, and is really a focus here that, on January 5th, the defendant told Pence, I think you have the power to decertify. When Pence was unmoved, the defendant threatened to criticize him publicly, which again, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We know what that means. I'm going to have to say you did a great disservice. And then this timing with it's possible, again, it's easy to lose track of what has been entered into the public record and what hasn't, Rachel, but this timing of that tweet, and we played you, I think that's Nick Fuentes, the notorious Nazi who dined with the president in the Bullhorn, reading out about Pence not doing what he's called to do. At 2:24 p.m., Trump was alone in the dining room when he issued a tweet attacking Pence and fueling the ongoing riot. Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones, which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth. And then, Jack Smith writes, 1 minute later, at 2:25 p.m., the Secret Service was forced to evacuate Pence to a secure location. Rachel, it doesn't quite say cause and effect, but it just lays the cause and the effect right there next to each other in adjacent sentences.
There's so much detail that they are presenting about that tweet and the context of it. They go to great lengths and great detail to explain that Trump was alone in the dining room off the Oval Office when he sent it. They go to great lengths to say that yes, there was another staffer who did have was sort of cleared to tweet in Trump's name, but he did not do that tweet. They go to great lengths to show that at the time that Trump sent that tweet, while he was alone and nobody else was there, it was definitely him who did it. He was both watching Fox News, which had already reported at that point and was continually reporting that the Capitol had been breached, that the rioters had made their way inside Congress where Mike Pence was. He was also watching Twitter where it was being reported in real time. I mean, they are saying, they go through all of those details like it was him and this is what he knew when he did it. And then they establish, you know, some of the other things that he tweeted around the election and around January 6th, arguably under the Supreme Court's, you know, rules around these things could be construed as official actions. When he did send statements in a sort of milquetoast way that said people should go home in peace and love, that was a kind of presidential thing to do. He was acting on the institutional interest of the U.S. government.
Presidential-ish.
But when he said Mike Pence... Yes, but when he said Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what needed to be done, there's nothing presidential about it. There is no way that this could be construed as doing anything other than advancing his personal, private, criminal interest in that moment. They just cover every single angle of it in a way that it just feels like a straitjacket.
There's also something, I mean, you made this mention before, Rachel. I mean, and we were sitting together, Lawrence, on the day of that immunity, both oral arguments and decision. You know, this effort basically, a largely successful effort in certain ways, aided by the Supreme Court, right, to make all this just disappear down the memory hole, right? As we sit here 34 days from an election in which we all know, everyone who covers this, everyone in politics, Democrat, Republican, across the ideological spectrum, understands that he's going to try to do the same thing again. That's obviously a certainty, right? And so this part, which seemed relevant today, and particularly relevant after at your very funny line last night about J.D. Vance being the first vice presidential nominee not to know who won the previous election. The defendant and his co-conspirators also demonstrated their deliberate disregard for the truth when they repeatedly changed the numbers. I love this. Changed the numbers in their baseless fraud allegations from day to day. The conspirators started with the allegation that 36,000 non-citizens voted in Arizona. 5 days later, it was beyond credulity that a few 100,000 didn't vote. 3 weeks later, the bare minimum was 40 or 50,000.
So the timing of this, less than 24 hours after we saw J.D. Vance on the debate stage, unable to answer the question of did Donald Trump lose the election, and J.D. Vance having publicly already said he would not have done what Mike Pence did. He would have done exactly. Donald Trump would only have to ask him once. Yeah. In fact, might not even have to ask him.
He might do it proactively. Yes.
Right. And then for this document to emerge today, where the star of today's document is Mike Pence, because he hasn't been in anything else we've been able to read. So this really is Mike Pence's moment in this story today. And every single step of this story that Mike Pence is in, Mike Pence is doing and saying the right thing every time. He's saying and doing what he was elected to do, what his oath of office told him to do, which is when Donald Trump says to him, you really should do this, every single time, he says no. Every single time.
Against interest and, of course, against the political pressure. Rachel.
I just wanted to jump in there and just follow sort of in the shadow of what Lawrence just said there. You know, you noted, Chris, like it's kind of hard to keep track of what's in the public record. And Lawrence was saying this sort of feels like the screenplay version. This helps you connect different things. One of the things that I never connected before, it's something that's described on page 63 of this document. We knew from Pence's memoir that when he was really making clear as of New Year's Day, as of January 1st, that he was not going to go along with this, that all the lobbying of him was not working. We know from his memoir that Trump threatened him and said, quote, hundreds of thousands of people are, quote, gonna hate your guts. We knew that he had done that. What I did not know before reading this today is that he's threatening them that hundreds of thousands of people are gonna effectively come after him for what he's doing here. And then immediately after he says that to Pence, Immediately afterwards, he tweets a reminder to all of his supporters to make sure you're going to be in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. I mean, when he makes that threat to Pence, he's already announced we'll be wild. Everybody come for January 6th. He tells them hundreds of thousands of people are going to come for you. And then he hits a reminder in Twitter telling people that they need to show up so that he can make good on the threat. It is just wielding the promise of an angry mob as a deliberate threat and as one that he is planning to make good on. And I've never seen it laid out that way before, even though I knew the individual pieces of it. And it just sent a chill down my spine.
Yeah, and Rachel, that dialogue that you pointed out there, there's a key line at the end which would play to a jury so perfectly. When Donald Trump is saying to Mike Pence, you know, you really got to do this, Mike Pence saying he's not going to do it, and then he's telling Pence people are going to be very disappointed in you. His last line to Mike Pence is, "You're too honest." That tells you what Donald Trump thinks the truth is.
Yes.
That Mike Pence is actually telling the truth. You're too honest, Mike Pence.
Yes, you're too honest being an admission of guilt.
So state of mind for Donald Trump exists throughout the document, including in the present, in those moments, you're too honest. But they carry the state of mind proof years after the fact. Right